Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. It is my pleasure. Hopefully everyone had a very good lunch. And my job, first and foremost, is to make sure you don't fall asleep after lunch. So I have the heart after lunch spot. I'm going to talk to you today about innovation. And obviously this is a theme that's been very prevalent throughout the conference. I'm going to try to take a bigger picture perspective on this. So I'm not going to be focusing on the perspective of, say, a provider or a particular client, but just more broadly, if you as an organization are trying to engage in innovation, whatever that might be, what are the necessary conditions for that to be successful? And more importantly, how are the talent management decisions that you place in your organization setting it up for you to be successful or perhaps not successful in that situation? Now, before we sort of jump into this, I think it is important to provide some context on why we should even be talking about innovation. Obviously, the last 5 years has been an unbelievable period of time in terms of economic growth or economic activity. You've seen unprecedented levels of growth in economies. Witness India, China, Indonesia. We were talking about various different growth rates in different countries earlier today. Unbelievable. And you've also seen unbelievable destruction of economic wealth in, say, the United States as well as in Europe. And these shocks, these recessionary shocks, have caused many organizations to struggle. Now, what's interesting is we've kind of made it through that period of time. Your organizations are still here. And I should point out, a recessionary period, we normally think about business failure. But economic growth brings tremendous amounts of competition. So it's not as if just because you're in a high growth area, your business survival is guaranteed. So both of these are very dynamic. Now, as we've come out of this, I think many people have taken sort of a sigh of relief, like, whew, we've sort of survived this period. But there's some interesting research I want to share with you to start this off, and I think it provides a good foundation for why innovation must be a part of the strategic plan of any successful organization. So there were some scholars at Harvard Business School and Northwestern University that did some work looking at what happened to organizations after recessions. So we go through this recession, and we have all these hard decisions to make. And then after the recession, we normally think, oh, life gets back to normal, we should be okay. And what they find is very interesting. So they look at 3 recessions, 80, 82, 90, 91, 2000, 2002. And what they look at is what happens to firms 3 years after the recession ends. And the results are very interesting. What they find is that 3 years after the recession, right, 17% of the firms that made it through the recession then fail. So they're permanently staggered, right? The recession damaged them so much to the extent that it was just a matter of time before they failed. 40% of the organizations that make it through the recession never get back to their pre-recession sales or profit levels. 40%, they're permanently damaged. Only 9% of the organizations that go through these recessions actually get to a point where they exceed pre-recession levels of performance after 3 years. Now, when I first read this study, this is pretty concerning information, right? I mean, because as leaders, we think about how we deal with these very traumatic periods that we might experience in a business cycle, but we never really think that after that we're going to have problems later on. And what this research shows is that what's going on here is that recessions or any type of external shock, right? Because tremendous economic growth is an external shock. Technological changes are external shocks. Recessions are external shocks. These are all game changers. They fundamentally change the mechanism of competition for industries. It never goes back. We never go back to the glory days, ever. And as a result, the game has changed, and the game now has new rules which pick new winners and new losers. And the fact that you're a winner to begin with has nothing to do with whether or not you're going to be a winner in the future. And interesting enough, some of those 9% that exceed pre-recession performance, some of them were actually firms that weren't doing very well before the recession. So the fact that you're a loser to begin with doesn't guarantee that you're going to be a loser in the future. Recessions or external shocks change the game. And so I guess it's against this backdrop that we begin thinking about innovation. And there's numerous examples that we think of in companies that have sort of struggled to make this transition as the game has changed. One of the ones that I think everybody can relate to is this situation. Sony versus Apple. And you go back to 2001 when Apple launches the iPod without much fanfare. You know, we stand in line now for iPhones, but at that point in time, there was no line, no queue to get an iPod. It wasn't necessarily being seen as sort of the thing that was going to change the world. And in fact, Apple at that time, if you went to most business schools, the cases we were teaching on Apple was how to not do business. They were not the darling company at that point in time. Sony, on the other hand, had the lion's share market in terms of mobile audio devices. Everybody remembers the old Walkman you had? That's still somewhere in the back of some closet somewhere? And of course, even if it wasn't a Sony product, you still called it a Walkman, right? Because this was such the dominant mind share. So they have the dominant market. They also own media companies, so they actually have the media. Apple launches, nobody else launches. It's in the middle of a recession. Everybody else is holding on to their money because they're concerned about the recession and its impact it's going to have on their financial performance. Apple, sort of desperate, they can't wait. They launch, nobody has a similar product. Fast forward, Apple has 75% market share in the MP3 market. Sony, anybody have a Sony MP3 device of any sort? Anyone in the room? One? That would be about right. They have about a 3% market share. It's what? Just over 11 years? And they've gone through 3 or 4 CEOs at that point in time? I mean, it's amazing. The game changes. And the fact that you were a winner to begin with has nothing to do with whether or not you're going to be a winner later. And the fact that you were a loser to begin with has nothing to do with whether you're going to be a loser later. And what this tells us is that innovation is the key. If the game has changed, if the rules have changed, then we must be able to do new things. The ability to do new things is driven by your ability to navigate innovation. And this is not something that is lost on executives and leaders around the world. There have been several studies and research done in terms of how they perceive innovation. One of the more recent ones done by the Boston Consulting Group, asking executives how do they think about innovation in terms of their organization. 76% of executives globally identify innovation as one of their top 3 strategic priorities. 76%. But what's interesting, you would normally think, well, these are markets that perhaps are going through some difficulties. They're trying to figure out ways to gain new market share. Interestingly enough, 90% of Indian executives and 81% of Chinese executives see innovation as a key, compared to only 66% of US executives. So again, don't think that the external shock is always something that's very negative. An external shock is anything that changes the nature of the business or the competitive dynamics. That is just, it could be a good thing, potentially, but that could be just as risky for your business as a decline in a market. Neither one of those guarantees your future success. So innovation is the key in this situation. So what is innovation? I'm an academic. Academics were notorious. We have to define the words that we use. And for me, I really view this as a 2-step process. Now, the thing that we typically think about is the creation, the aha moment, the Einstein moment. It's when we come up with a new idea. And that's very important, obviously. But the reality is that most new ideas don't matriculate into outcomes, even if they're great ideas. The second part of innovation is converting that, harnessing that into some type of product or process or service, some tangible mechanism to actually derive economic value for someone or some entity. And so it's a 2-step process. And the one thing I want you to get out of this, it's more than just coming up with good ideas. And in fact, it's typically the second part of this process that's harder than the first part. And I think this is shown that there's been some other work that's asked executives to what are the big barriers to your organization being more innovative. The number one was risk-averse culture. That we can come up with ideas, but our people are unwilling to try them or implement them, or they go kicking and screaming, thus it slows us down. Number 2, lengthy development time. In terms of how long we implement these ideas into something that's tangible. Number 5 reason was not enough good ideas. So that was not the number one priority for why these executives viewed their organization as lagging behind in the innovation goals they would like to have as an entity. So it's harnessing as well as creating. And typically it's the harnessing part that's a little more difficult. So how do you do this? How do you create an environment that encourages innovation and supports repeated innovation over time, and so that you can have creation and harnessing? Well, I've been doing quite a bit of work around this for several years, working with different organizations across the world to understand what are the types of things that they're doing. And I like to sort of paint out for you a perspective on how I think organizations perform. So all of you represent an organization, and that organization would have an internal environment. A thing that, pretty much is pretty basic. You have a strategy or a set of tasks, things that you try to do, right? Or things that you say you're not going to do. And you have a culture. And the culture is the way you do things. And so this is, when you come up with a task or a strategy and a culture and they fit, typically that's success. And it works very well. You sort of on your mission. That is until something happens externally. So you're going along with your strategy. You're going to make something at this price and sell it to these customers. Your competitor goes, that's a great idea. I'm going to make the same thing, but I'm going to sell it at a lower price. Better come up with a new strategy. That product that you said was so wonderful and your clients love so much that you're making so much money on, the government, wherever, some government has decided that's illegal. Can't sell that anymore. Got to come up with a new strategy. Those wonderful people that you thought would be perfect for your culture, that you were going to employ and they would allow you to do all the wonderful things you set out to do, you come to find out it's not enough of them. You have to hire other people. But the other people, they like different things. Better change your culture. Right? So what happens over and over again is that you come up with an internal environment. The external environment could care less about this wonderful idea of yours, and it changes. And as a result, you have to come up with another internal environment. You have to adjust your strategy. You have to adjust your culture. And this goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And many organizations fail here because they are unable to see the change or they do not respond. However, even if you see the change and you try to respond, that does not guarantee success. Typically, the response requires some type of innovation. The adaptation to the change in the external environment requires an adaptation. That is an innovation. So can you pull that off? Can you come up with the idea and can you harness that idea in a meaningful way? How do you do that more successfully than not? Well, the reality is that the way you do this is the way you manage your talent. Because ultimately, this idea generation process and this harnessing process is embedded in the behaviors of your workforce. It's the people you hire. It's what you tell them to do. It's what you train them on. It's how you motivate them. It's how you organize them. It's how you evaluate them. That those key decisions determine whether or not you as an entity will be more or less likely to generate and harness ideas. And so I think when we oftentimes talk about the strategic role of HR, or HR having a seat at the table, listen, the decisions that we make consciously or subconsciously, explicit or implicit, about those questions ultimately will determine whether or not we as organizations have a means to actually adapt and respond. And so I don't even typically engage in that conversation because it seems to me it's impossible for you to be able to do this effectively over time if you're not having a strategic conversation about talent management. So this is the basis by which I sort of understand how organizations are able to respond. And if I look at within that talent management box, how these companies answer these 5 questions, there's some themes that tend to come out in my work. There's some themes that tend to come out in the work that I do with organizations. And I'll share a few of those insights with you. So 3 things that I see consistently in organizations that can have an innovative culture. So this is not coming up with a one-hit wonder product. This is consistently being able to see change in the external environment and respond. Organizations that do this well when it comes to managing their talent, what they're able to do, they acquire complementary knowledge. They possess complementary knowledge within their organizations. They think creatively about how they combine knowledge within their organizations, and they train their leaders to be very effective at opportunity recognition. So I'm going to talk about each of these 3 and give you some examples of some different organizations that have done this and hopefully provoke you and provide you with some sparks of interest around ways this might show up in your organization. So acquisition of knowledge. This is not a new idea, and I'll sort of give some credit to economists from the 50s, Penrose, who wrote exactly the same resources when used in combination with different types and amounts of other resources, provide a different set of services or set of services. And clearly, she's an economist. What is she saying? What does that mean? And in essence, what she's basically saying is that most innovation is actually not us coming in with something we never thought of before. Most innovation is actually taking existing bodies of knowledge to things that we already had, combining them and applying them in a new way that we hadn't thought of before. And that's actually about 90% of the innovation you see in organizations is actually combining, taking complementary pieces of information and putting it together. Innovation is typically driven by the acquisition of complementary resources. can find knowledges or bases of knowledge that are actually complementary and combine them, this in and of itself tends to generate a very positive, innovative outcome for me. I'll give you an example. So I've been doing some work looking at patenting. This is one type of innovation that you might see. Many of the industries represented here are heavy patenters, and this is something that is of strategic importance to you. And we're interested in understanding what are the things that drive patenting behavior. Now, one of the things we know without any shadow of a doubt is that R&D investment is a big predictor of whether or not you can generate patents. So if you go out and hire researchers, R&D people, engineers, generally you will generate more patents. Interestingly enough, though, the return on R&D dollar differs dramatically across organizations. So for the same dollar, some organizations get more patents than others. Why is this? And what we think is that this is a story about complementary knowledge. So we know that R&D investment will help you get patents, but we think that patenting in of itself, which is in essence taking this great idea and harnessing it, that actually is a different skill set. It's very different than actually coming up with the idea. You need to understand, well, what is the patent law? What else is out there? Is this the idea that I actually can safeguard using some type of legal system? That's a very different expertise than, say, somebody who's an electrical engineer or a software engineer. And so what we know is that patent law expertise can play a very important role in converting this great idea, harnessing, into something that's very tangible. And so if you combine these two pieces of knowledge, that perhaps they actually are complementary, that this ultimately will lead to higher levels of patent production. So we did some research on this. We looked at Fortune 500 firms, and we looked at their patenting output over time. And what we found was very insightful. We looked at firms, and obviously if you look at this chart, what you see is if you spend more money on spend more money on R&D, you get more patents. But there's a big difference between the firms that also co-invested in patent law expertise, and in this case, this was hiring individuals who had patent law expertise into your organization and creating structures for them to work with the R&D lab in a very collaborative manner, formally creating complementarity between their resources. What you see is a dramatic increase in the dollar of return that they get on that R&D dollar. And what's even more interesting about this finding is that there's a bigger impact on this co-investment for low R&D spenders as opposed to high. And when we did some qualitative interviews with these organizations, what we found was that in those low R&D situations, and these are typically organizations that are cash-strapped, they don't have the money to make that investment, the patent law expertise allowed them to dig deeper, be more wise about how they spent their R&D dollar, and extract more value for their R&D investment. So it was actually more critical for them when there was a scarcity than when there was not a scarcity. So what does this mean from a talent management perspective? Well, the questions you begin to ask yourself are, what are forms of complementary knowledge within my organization? So you have a desire as an organization to implement innovation and new product launches in a particular area, or innovations that might serve a certain client, or processes that might reduce your costs. What are all the bodies of knowledge necessary to actually pull that activity off? Think of all the various components of knowledge that might be relevant. How is that represented within your organization? And is there any way in which that knowledge is actually combined? And then if you don't have that knowledge in your organization, this begins to change the way you think about who you should hire, the recruitment and staffing decisions that you make in your organization, and also where you might hire from, because you're adopting a more complementary approach to knowledge bases. Now, of course, if you have this complementary knowledge, you have to figure out a way to combine it. And that's a necessary component. So how do you combine knowledge within organizations? Well, I mean, listen, it's not that complicated. It happens through relationships. This is the way in which we exchange information most effectively. It's through relationships. And what we find is that successful organizations are very proactive in thinking about the relationships that their employees form. They don't leave it to chance. That this is actually very strategically driven. And I'll give you some examples, right? They think about the networks of their employees. Who are they talking to, and how are they exchanging information? Now, one example we alluded to earlier is Apple. And I think Apple actually does an exemplary job around this. They have a very explicit, very formal thought process about how they will combine the knowledge of their workers. And one of the innovations that they've brought to the industry is not just the product, but the way in which they make the product. Typically, in most technological firms, what you have is a very sequential process. You have designers, and you have manufacturers, and you have marketers, and you have salespeople, each of them sort of working on the phase after the other part has been completed. And what Apple has always said is we don't want to have beta tests. We don't want to have test launch. When we launch, it has to work. It has to work 100% well. And one of the ways they've been able to do that is to use parallel design, where they have all the various factors that might come into play around designing and launching a product. All the various departments work simultaneously together from the beginning. So it's a lot of co-meetings with the marketing team, the engineering team, the software design team, all of them consistently meeting together at all phases of this process. Now think about the meetings that you have at work. The meetings that you have just with other HR people are difficult enough. Now add in finance people, add in accounting people, add in operations people. Do those meetings typically go very seamlessly? No, they don't. They start using acronyms you never heard of before. They have different assumptions. Fundamentally, they're different types of people. It's hard, isn't it? And one of the things that's interesting is Apple, they began developing this culture where people began to celebrate how many meetings they went to every week. Anybody seeking out more meetings for their schedule right now? No. Typically, we think, let me get out of this meeting so I can get back to work, right? And what they're saying is, no, the work is the meeting, because if you're trying to solve complex problems and generate innovation, it must include the combination of complementary knowledge that only happens through relationship you have to meet. And it's really changing the culture about how you think about doing this. Now, the other thing that's interesting about Apple is they also are very appreciative, despite the fact that they are an extremely successful company, we don't know everything. And in fact, we probably know nowhere near everything. And so they have a very formal strategy of actively networking outside the organization to combine knowledge that is not necessarily Apple's knowledge. And they're very explicit about forming partnerships with other entities to think about ways that they can actually combine their expertise. They cultivate these relationships. They think about who knows more about stuff than we know. Can we talk to them? And this becomes a mechanism by which they actually drive product development and innovation. And this is all about avoiding that not inventing syndrome. And interestingly enough, the iPod, the original idea for that did not come from Apple. It came from an external consultant who was speaking with Apple and said, you have these different forms of technology. Had you ever thought about combining them? And Apple said, no, we never thought about that. That's a good idea. Now, I don't know the terms of that external consultant's contract. I hope they had a clause in there with some profit sharing. Who knows? But one of the things that was interesting is our opening speaker today talked about this importance of having the buyer form strong relationships with the supplier and sort of engaging with them. And I think this is very important because it represents this opportunity for the combination of complementary knowledge. And he was very forthright saying, I don't know all this stuff. Perhaps the provider can know more, but they're never going to know my business better than me. So perhaps in that combination, we can generate innovation. And you see this growing and I think becoming more prominent. One of the more recent examples that I saw, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, was Intel's decision to develop a strategic partnership with Baidu around a research lab. And what they've done is they've provided the designers, the programmers at Baidu to their latest technology, and they're using that to think about ways in which they can develop software for mobile devices. And I think this makes great sense, right? We all know that this is a very large, growing market that they serve. Intel's thinking, well, we don't know enough about that market. They do. Perhaps they don't know enough about the software or the hardware aspects of it. We do. Is there opportunities for innovation there? As opposed to framing everything as a competition, appreciating that the value comes in the combination of complementary resources. So complementarity, combination, and then the last aspect. One other thing to point out, there's some great work that's come out of University of Virginia. A gentleman named Rod Cross has done some work looking at how network structure predicts your innovation capability. And what he points out is if you're trying to solve a problem where you don't know what you don't know, right? You know there's a problem, but you really don't know how you're going to solve it, your network should look like that. A whole bunch of different knots, nodes all over the place, where you're just going to potentially unrelated parties. People that would not be the usual suspects that you would typically talk about, to think about, well, how would you think about this problem? That tends to be more successful in driving innovation, particularly radical innovation. If you have a problem where you know you don't know, but you know exactly what it is, then you can be more directive in how you go about doing this. And so your network, it can be a little more tighter, more dense. You can be more directed in terms of who you go to. And then if you think about, well, you know exactly what it is and you know exactly what you have to do, then this is a much more directed network, far more dense, less diversity across the range. And now, interestingly enough, we spend most of our life, I think, on the execution type of task, and that's primarily going to be that last network. And then when it comes time for us to become innovative, we go to the people we work with all the time and we ask them for great ideas, and you know what we get? The same ideas we had. Because they've been talking to us just like we've been talking to them. And what I'm pointing out here is that innovation requires a behavioral change, and that behavioral change comes in the nature of our relationships. Absent that, you will not be successful. The network structure must match the task. So if you're moving to an innovation strategy, you need to have an innovation-oriented network. So, combination. Who are your people talking to? Do you know? Have you any idea? Have you managed that? Have you thought about that? Do you measure it? What is the diversity of the individuals that they speak with? Have you thought about that? Now, what's interesting is all the HR technology that we have today really allows us to think about these things, and we have the ability to manage it if we have the insight to understand so. Last thing, opportunity recognition. All this is great, but we know that senior leadership provides the resources to allow these things to occur in organizations. Absent recognition for the opportunity for innovation, it will not happen. So top management, they're responsible for identifying what resources we have and determining ways in which those resources are combined. And that's true in any domain across the organization. That is ultimately the responsibility of any senior leadership. Thinking about what resources we should have and thinking about how we should utilize them. And what we find in our research is that the expertise and the behaviors of top leaders set the tone for whether or not there will or will not be innovation in their organization. I'll give you an example. So going back to the study we were doing on patenting, what we found was that senior leaders that had patenting expertise in the top management team were more successful at deriving value out of this combination of patent law expertise and R&D than teams or companies that did not have this expertise in their senior leadership. So some companies we found, they would hire patent lawyers, they'd have R&D investment, and they would get some patenting. And then other organizations would have patent lawyers, they'd have R&D investment, and they also would have a senior leader in the top management team that had patent law expertise. They got way more, 39% more patents. And what we found was these senior leaders, because they had the ability to recognize opportunity, were very proactive at setting up formal mechanisms and channels to combine that expertise, to measure it, to encourage it, to set the culture around it. And that the teams that did not have that skill set in their senior leadership, if it happened by chance. So they were much more able to extract value from the expertise they had in the firm. We also know, this is a great study done by some looking at the leadership behaviors. And what they found, this was a setting of Taiwanese electronics and telecommunications firms. And what they found was that the leaders in organizations that engage in what we'll call transformational leadership behaviors. And this would be things such as using intellectual stimulation to lead your people, such as telling people, think of 5 ways in which we can do this, and then come up with reasons why that might not be successful. And then come back and think about how we might overcome those. Providing those types of challenges as opposed to directing people and saying, go do this, right, which is a much more transactional style. Using more inspirational mechanisms of leadership. Providing a vision to individuals and saying, this is what we would like to be. I like to get ideas from you about how we can get there. As opposed to leaders that would come in and say, I want you to go do this task with this outcome. That when leaders engage in this more transformational leadership behavior, what you got is a stronger innovation culture and very tangible outcomes. Higher R&D intensity and greater levels of patents. So the actual behaviors of the leaders set the tone for the culture within the organization. So what does this mean? Well, interestingly enough, do we take innovation leadership as one of the criteria we use when we're thinking about succession planning? See, many of our leaders, if you think about it, what is the path that gets them to senior positions? Operational execution. It is actually a very different behavior that typically gets them in those positions of authority or power. And then we put them in those positions and we ask them, now I want you to be innovative and drive future growth in new markets. And they go, I've never done that, or I haven't done that for a long period of time. How are we training, developing, or selecting people to have the opportunity, recognition, and the leadership behaviors necessary to drive innovation culture? Is that part of what we're doing, or are we rewarding based on past behavior that was very different? So, in conclusion, what I'm trying to point out to you is that the decisions we make about how we manage talent set the conditions for whether or not you will or will not be innovative. It's who you hire, what they know, how you motivate them, how you organize them, and how you evaluate them. That will set the stage for whether or not you can engage in this outcome of innovation. And there are 3 things that you should be considering as you're making those decisions about those 5 questions. What portfolio of talent is needed for the creation and harnessing of ideas in your setting? So you have some great ideas about things you want to do. Fantastic. Who are the people you need to have to create those ideas? But when it comes to converting that into a tangible product, what are the other complementary skill sets you must possess? And don't assume it's going to be in the same person. That's just too much to ask. You're asking me to be an expert on R&D and something else? That's very difficult to do. Second, how should your people be interacting? With whom should they interact, both inside the organization and outside the organization? What is your strategy around that? How do you evaluate that? Have you given any consideration to it? If I did a network analysis of your organization, I can make some pretty strong predictions about when and where innovation will or will not occur. The science on this is very strong, and thus it's something that we can manage. And finally, what skills and behaviors should your leaders possess to enhance opportunities for innovation to happen? We oftentimes have innovation as part of one of our strategic priorities, and some of us have even talked about how innovation is one of the core cultural components of an organization. How is that manifested in the way in which we develop and identify leaders, particularly senior leaders in our organization? Because they set the table for whether or not those opportunities are realized and exploited. So hopefully this has given you some insights about how innovation is consistently done over time. I hope that provides you with some frameworks about how you might think about that for your organization. This is an area of very strong interest and passion for me. I've been doing quite a bit of work on this, and I'm very interested in continuing doing work on that. So I thank you for your time, and if you have any questions about the work we've done or ideas about ways in which we might even think about what that looks like in your organization, please contact me. We'd love to have a conversation with you. So thank you very much, and I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Ian. That was really interesting. My question is about the relationship between providers and clients. When you work in partnership, one of the things that a client always expects you to do is to continually innovate. And I'm sure all of the providers around here accept that. But one of the things I've also encountered is a great deal of resistance from the clients to innovation, particularly when you come and present new ideas that have not been tried before. So I'm interested in the insights that you might have around how clients and providers can work together to push innovation in joint outsourcing type solutions?
Well, I mean, I think I answer that differently depending on whether or not I'm the client or the provider or their perspective they take. But the fundamental issue here is all motivation for innovation comes from the external environment. That's the first thing you got to appreciate. All motivation, see, left up to our own, we would never do anything different. Anybody seeking change? Nobody seeks change. You change because you have to. So all motivation for innovation comes from changes in the external environment. Thus, if I were a provider coming to a client to talk about innovation, the first thing I need to talk about is what has been the relevant change in that client's external environment that makes this innovation relevant. Right? And I think that's probably where you get a lot of resistance, because the innovation that you may be speaking about has nothing to do with the client's external environment. So what is their motivation to change? So if you're trying to embed them, and particularly if you're trying to form a partnership with them around innovative behavior, then you have to be able to have the innovation be relevant to the types of shocks that they are facing in their business. So the good providers know their client's business, and they frame those things around those issues. And it's not something that necessarily I think all providers think about, because they're worried about their business, right? But you perhaps are facing a different external shock than your client. And I think the same thing is true from the client perspective, right? So the client has the external shock. They're scrambling to try to figure out. And one of the things that the clients need to appreciate is that a sense of overcoming a sense of hubris, that they don't know everything. Oftentimes, clients will say, I'm going to outsource this, not because I can't do it, because it's not cost effective for me to do it. And if I had enough money, I would gladly do it, right? And that's just based from a strength of, well, we have capability. But maybe you don't actually have capability, and this is an opportunity for you to learn. Do you look at your provider as a source of knowledge that you can learn from that will enhance not just that particular, say, HR function, but your broader strategy for your firm. And I think that that's the framing of how those meetings start goes a long way towards setting up the stage of whether or not this is a transactional relationship or an innovation partnership. And I think having some co-investment that is not necessarily always tied to the immediate project also begins to set that stage up, because it's also the case that you don't always you're not able to dictate for certain the outcome of the innovative behavior. Now, the terms that I just described are probably not relevant for every relationship, which suggests to you that you cannot engage in innovation partnerships with everybody. Right? That's not necessarily what those relationships are. But I think that's how I would frame it. Other questions? Thoughts?
Thank you very much. Thank you.